Okay, so we have a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, which has been negotiated at United Nations. And 122 member states of United Nations voted for the treaty, and it's incredibly good news. We also, the campaign, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, which all of us that campaign to abolish nuclear weapons are part of, have won the Nobel Peace Prize. And I just think that's absolutely wonderful. We are grains of sand, every one of us, but grains of sand can change the course of a river, and that's what we've been doing and what we need to continue to do. So I wanted to tell you the story of the Ban Treaty, because there are a lot of myths and there's a lot of opposition to it from governments like the UK government. And so you need to have the arguments clear in your minds when you're out on the streets facing the media garbage that the UK gets put out about what's going on with this. And Scotland's had a very important part to play in this from the beginning. And so I thought we would just start by telling the story. And the story begins with United Nations at the very outset in 1945. The very first resolution that the United Nations passed was that the use of atomic energy should not be used as a weapon of war. And that's even assuming that the use of force is justified in some cases, which is not my position. But if it is, nuclear weapons are an anathema. And I think it's really important, because we've got very good news, to just consider for a few minutes what we're actually facing with the weapons that are based at Faslane. There are warheads there on missiles, on submarines, patrolling international waters all the time, 24/7. They are controlled by a woman who is prepared to annihilate hundreds of thousands of people and has gone on record as saying so. The missiles are leased from a country with a president that I need say very little about in terms of risk assessment or safety. The trouble is that these weapons, if any of them are detonated, will not just affect nuclear weapons states. They will affect everybody across the whole planet. And half the payload of one of the Trident submarines that patrols from Faslane, if that amount of nuclear detonation took place either between two countries or as some kind of terrible accident, you're talking about a situation that could put so much carbon into the atmosphere that it would reduce the world's temperatures to a point where there would be nuclear winter across the whole of Africa. And that would mean billions of people starving to death. It would mean increased conflict because of the resource shortages. It would mean that not a single one of the Sustainable Development Goals could be managed. So they had a grip on it in 1945, but we now know it's even worse. So that's important to remember all the time when we're talking about nuclear weapons. They're not some kind of political toy. And that's why when the International Court of Justice was asked to make a ruling on these things, the conclusion that they reached was that there exists an obligation to bring an end to this, and they found against the legality of nuclear weapons. There were some little loopholes about, if you could, which were legal niceties which have been used by the nuclear weapon states to continue their appalling behaviour, because they were talking about there might be a possible nuclear weapon that was so small and so possibly targeted in such a remote area that it might technically be legal, but no such nuclear weapon actually exists, and it's not likely to. So here in Scotland, Trident Ploughshares campaign saw that this gave us a tremendous opportunity, and so the actions, direct action to say to the government, if you're not going to disarm these things, we'll have to do it, began. And I'm sure you're all aware of the many big blockades at Faslane, and this is probably just a reminder for most of you of the 3 women that got onto a signalling barge, and it was no longer invisible after they'd thrown all the computers and technical equipment into the sea, and they were then put on trial and they were acquitted. And if you're not familiar with this story, I recommend the book. And the Scottish legal system immediately made it very difficult for anybody else to do something similar and use the same defence. But it was a very good result. And what we had in opposition to that were political statements like Obama saying, not in my lifetime. Clinton saying, in some day, in some century. I'm sorry, that's not good enough. These weapons are indiscriminate, they're inhumane, and they must be banned by international treaty, and now, thank goodness, they are. You can see that these were the other weapons that met that fate, and we now have nuclear weapons proudly added to the list, because the unacceptable harm they cause is completely unacceptable. So how did this come about? The international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons came into being in around 2007, and it was really the result of a number of initiatives looking at what the actual damage these weapons could do, and looking at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. And Scotland was in this right at the very beginning. I was very proud to be involved in the Scottish Peace Covenant. We desire that Scotland should be known for its international contribution to peace and justice, rather than being a launchpad for waging war. That's still good enough for me. And I think there's another of these circular interesting tales, in that this is the illustration for the Peace Covenant that people signed back in 2006, 2007 by Alistair Gray, and the original painting of that was auctioned to pay for towards the cost of the team that went to New York this year to negotiate the ban treaty. I think that's very nice. This was the Scottish launch in the Parliament in 2010 of the Scottish campaign. We were calling it a nuclear weapons convention at that point. And there was a lot of things that happened in 2010. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is supposed to control nuclear weapon proliferation by stopping other countries getting nuclear weapons, but the nuclear weapons armed states are supposed to give up their nuclear weapons. That's been on the go since 1968, and it's going nowhere, and it's been going nowhere. That bit of it, that gap in it, which wasn't filled by the ICJ ruling, to say you have to get rid of these nuclear weapons. That was the sticking point for the nuclear weapon states. So eventually, of course, other countries started to proliferate, and we went from 5 to 8 to 9 nuclear armed states. And so in 2010, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent had a look at what they were actually dealing with, given that they'd had various crises brought about through accelerated climate change and so on and so forth. And they reached the conclusion that in the event of a nuclear detonation, they would not be able to respond. There was no meaningful response that the International Red Cross or Red Crescent could make. And the 2010 NPT ended again with no firm decisions. The nuclear weapon states used their power of veto to block any decisions about progressing a nuclear weapons-free Middle East, about making decisions about reducing their arsenals. It was a disaster. But the the then Secretary General of United Nations put out a call to commit to achieving a world without nuclear weapons, and expressed his deep concern about the fact that these guys just weren't getting it together and that nothing was happening. And so the Norwegian government offered to host a conference in Norway to actually look in detail at what the consequences of nuclear weapons use and or accident might be. And it was the first intergovernmental meeting. It wasn't. It was. There were UN agencies there, but it wasn't a UN meeting. The Red Cross were there, but a huge number of the world's governments thought it was important enough to turn up. The P5, of course, snubbed it. They said they weren't going. They said it was unrealistic. It was a distraction from their real work, trying to get rid of nuclear weapons. So at the end of that conference, the atmosphere and the discourse in the world had already started to change, with a general acceptance that nuclear weapons would have a catastrophic humanitarian consequence if they were ever used. The urgency was much more underscored, and people had begun to really question the P5's discourse about how the discussions were pulling apart the disarmament, because they weren't actually doing anything. So then there was a second conference in Mexico, and this time 146 of the member states of the United Nations showed up, and it was still boycotted, but India and Pakistan turned up to that one. And there was new evidence produced, and it was also realised at that it's possible to eliminate weapons after you have a treaty. So that was a big kind of breakthrough, was realising that you could do the treaty first and get the nuclear weapon states on board afterwards. So the third conference was held in Vienna, and iCAN worked very hard to make sure that there was a strong civil society presence, giving evidence and talking at that meeting. And again, there's Bill Kidd and Veronica and Judith from MEDACT and various other Scottish people that made it to that meeting. And so Scottish CND again was engaged in that process. And we also were really upping the ante. We'd had Faslane 365 at the base, and good campaigning going on in Scotland, and the change in position of the Scottish government to very definitely anti-Trident. So the three conferences really underline these points. The catastrophe that use of nuclear weapons would be. There is no effective humanitarian response. The use has been underestimated, and there is a legal gap. So at that stage, United Nations agreed to hold an open-ended working group, and they invited all member states and encouraged all member states to participate, to say, right, okay, we've got all this, you've had these discussions, the NPT is a bit stuck, we're not saying it's a bad treaty, but we're saying it's not going forward. So let's have a big forum and not have any consensus, not have any blocking at it. It's open to vote if you need to do that. And let's actually have civil society there as well, presenting evidence about risk, about effect, about impact from people that don't have a political axe to grind. And let's get all the member states there and actually see what we can come up with. So it was mandated by the General Assembly, and it was they put time and money into 15 days in Geneva for the treaty. And this is my proud moment, because I got to, on behalf of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, I got to make an input about the Scottish position and the democratic deficit. I also got into private, off-the-record briefings with the UK diplomats and asked them what they were going to do when we got independence and stuff like that. But I was able to get something on the record from Scotland into that meeting, which made me very happy indeed. So the working group ended up, it worked very well with great goodwill, although the nuclear weapon states were all outside the door, bad-mouthing it and not participating. And some of their proxies, including Australia, behaved very badly and really were extremely negative about the efforts that were being made. And the conclusion that was being reached by the end of the conference was that they wanted to recommend that United Nations start negotiations for a ban. And these guys were all banging on about their international security being threatened by that. And so people were working very hard to try and maintain consensus and take those views into consideration and soften the language and not be too directive about things. But at 10 to 5 on the last day, the Australian diplomat got up and said, actually, do you know what? My government isn't going to support this, so you're going to have a vote on it. And at that point, one of the quick-witted diplomats from a nuclear-free state said, well, in that case, can we go back to the form of words before we softened it? And so that was what happened. So it was actually a very strong recommendation that was strengthened and passed overwhelmingly. And there we all were, United Nations, a conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, and the really important bit, leading to their elimination. That's what has to come next. And that was 2 sessions last year. I was there for the whole of the March one and the whole of the summer one, and we managed to get a really good, strong delegation from Scotland with our great banner, and this is us at the very start in New York on the Women's March to Ban the Bomb, in the pouring rain, getting soaking wet, and generally having a pretty good time. The conference president was Elaine White from Costa Rica, who was quite marvellous in her ability to engage with civil society, to treat everybody with huge respect and great detailed attention to try and get she was absolutely determined that we were going to get this treaty. This is Sue Coleman Hazeldine, who, along with Setsu Thurlow, gave evidence as nuclear weapons survivors. Sue survived testing in Maralinga, and she spoke very, very movingly about her 47-year-old daughter who died last year of cancer, having had a series of 4 or 5 miscarriages and stillbirths. She never was able to give Sue any grandchildren, and she died at the age of 47 as a result of Sue's exposure. So the people that are suffering from the testing and the weapons that have already happened are still suffering and affected. Setsuko was 13 years old when the bomb was detonated over Hiroshima. She was a Star 1 maths student at school that was actually engaged in code breaking for the Japanese government. She saw a flash, and her classmates, who were also 13, were vaporized. She managed to crawl out of that, and you can have a look at the iCAN site and hear her testimony, and it was extremely powerful and difficult to listen to. We did a Scottish side account, so we had lots of diplomats came and heard us. So we have here Isabel Smith, who some of you might know from independence campaigning, 87-year-old who now lives in the US of A but came back here to try and help us win the referendum. Flavia from CND, Amy from UN House in Edinburgh, and that's me, and Dagmar also from UN House in Edinburgh, Andy Hinton, who went around wearing his kilt the whole time, it was great, from Aberdeen, and Michael Orgel from MEDAC. So we had a really good session, and we made our presence very, very much felt. Dagmar was a huge asset because she speaks about 3 or 4 languages, and so although English was the first language of the conference, she was able to really get in about some of the diplomats, and we were getting a much more textured understanding of what their views on things were. So when we weren't having our side event and inviting the diplomats to hear the Scottish story, and we also produced a briefing from Scotland, which is also part of the official record at United Nations. So even though Scotland can't attend as a nation, we do have a couple of bits of paper in there, so that's good. But we also were running around the conference, counting who was there, monitoring what was being said, sharing that, and attending other people's side events. It was a very active and busy time. So at 10 a.m. there was a vote, and this was the result, which was just fantastic. At the end of it all, we had 122 member states in favour, 1 against, which was the Netherlands. And that was very important and interesting because the Netherlands is a NATO state. The Netherlands were there because the ordinary people of the Netherlands worked like beavers, got an incredible petition with 50,000 signatures demanding that their government attended the negotiations. So even though the government didn't want to go because they were under so much pressure from the US, people power got them there. And the view of the diplomat from the Netherlands softened and changed as the conference went on. He was hearing these arguments. He was very regretful that he couldn't get a go-ahead from his government to support the treaty, and pretty much said so in his speech. And the reason given was that to sign the treaty would not be compatible with their NATO obligations. Anyway, we got the treaty, and there's Elaine, and her whole team from Costa Rica all arrived on the last day dressed in white, because Costa Ricans wear white when they're working for peace. So there we have it. 2017, they're banned. So what does that actually mean, that they're banned? It means that there's a preamble, and then there's the actual clauses that are within the treaty. And I strongly recommend that you get onto the internet and read the treaty. It's really beautifully written document. But this is the preamble outlines what the treaty is about and why it's there. And that's a very important part of the treaty, because if there is some nitty-gritty argument about whether assist means giving money or whether assist means helping somebody lift something up, when you have that argument further down the line, it's the preamble you go back to see what the intention within the treaty was. And these are some of the things that the need to completely eliminate. Deeply concerned about the catastrophic humanitarian, concerned by the slow pace, the ICJ obligation to bring to a conclusion. It's very, very strong, all the language within the preamble. And the treaty itself, the prohibitions is the first part of it, and these include developing, testing, production, stockpiling, but also transfer, use, threat of use. So that puts deterrence theory out the window, because it's no longer acceptable to the world that you can threaten to use nuclear weapons as part of your security strategy. Stationing, deployment or installation, and also part of the stuff about assistance and military alliances means that it will make it very difficult for a state that has nuclear weapons to negotiate or work with a state that doesn't, because if a state signed up to the treaty, they're bound not to enter into a military alliance with a nuclear weapons state. And full cooperation between states in fulfilling the obligations. There's also a clause about educating. We have to educate our children to know what nuclear weapons are and what they do. There's positive obligations which recognise the damage that's been done to people and the need for remediation of the land and also for people. And the big question, of course, is about the nuclear weapon states. Yes, they can join the treaty, but they have to do one of two things. They have to either get rid of their nuclear weapons before they join, in which case that's subject to some form of verification which is not yet outlined, but once the treaty comes into force, the states that are in the treaty will then negotiate exactly what verification means. So they have to destroy them before they join and have it verified that they have destroyed them. Or else they have to sign up to an agreed, legally binding time limit for their dismantling and destruction, which again would be to a programme that was agreed by the states. So it'll enter into force as soon as 50 states have ratified. So we've already got 53 states signed up. We thought that was going to take forever. We thought that would take a while. But actually we achieved that within the first week. There's 3 or 4 states that are already ratified. That means they have to put the terms of the treaty into their national legislation. So it has to. It's not something that one government can say they agree to the treaty, but the next government that comes along can change their mind. It's got to be actually put into the legislative process of that country, so that it's in the law of the land. So that takes a wee bit longer, but maybe a year, 2 years. So it provides the missing link to the NPT, and it puts nuclear weapons beyond the pale, which is really, this is the kind of thing, of course, that starts to happen. So this is Brian Quayle, Angie Zelter. A week after the ban treaty, they were at the Coalport camp and they blockaded and they discussed with the police whether the police knew that there was a ban treaty and whether they should be discussing with their colleagues whether to actually maybe change their minds about where their responsibilities lay. That then went to court last week and they were found guilty, not surprisingly. They were admonished. That was where it went. So the leadership that was shown by iCAN is really significant because it was the humanitarian impact. The countries that understand and know Costa Rica is a peaceful country that is capable of doing this. And it's the medical experts and disaster experts understanding of what the weapons do. They were critical factors. That and the stories of the survivors are really what put. Now this is what the United States put out to the NATO members before the treaty was negotiated, when it was still at the open-ended working group stage. And they made this list of things that they said, these things will happen if you go and sign up to this ban treaty. We don't want you to do that. It would be terrible, they said, the Americans said. It would be terrible because it aims primarily to stigmatise nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. Yes. The effect would be wide-ranging. and degrade enduring security relations, delegitimises nuclear deterrence, impact non-parties, states that are not in it, as well as states that are party to the treaty. It could even have an impact before it enters into force. Yes, it did. It has. These are designed to ban advocates to destroy the basis for US extended nuclear deterrence. Got it in one, you know. These are exactly the reasons, all of these reasons are exactly why we are absolutely convinced that the ban treaty will impact on the nuclear armed states. You have it from the horse's mouth. So when they say they're never going to pay any attention to it, and they're not going to sign it, and they're never going to disarm, and they're not going to, accession to the treaty is incompatible with the policy of nuclear deterrence. Yes, that's true. They put tremendous pressure on to try and stop it because they know it's effective. Already there is a change in the dialogue in international politics because the ban treaty is there. So in Scotland we have, at this point in time, we have 4 partners. To be a partner in iCAN, you basically go online and sign up to be a partner. You're obliged to wear the badge, punt the story, work for nuclear disarmament globally as well as locally, and to feed back what's happening and what you're doing to the international community and share that with them. But they all work autonomously. All the partners can do exactly what they work in the ways that they like. We try and share the messaging, but everybody interprets it according to their own campaigning. So there is an iCAN UK, which there isn't an iCAN Scotland, although there are Scottish partners. We're about to have the first Scottish roundtable of partners at some point before the end of the year. But it's open for signature on the 20th of September, and so we're now in a different stage of campaigning. Our main aim was to get the ban treaty and to put as much pressure as we could on the member states of the United Nations to support the ban treaty. They've done it. They've done that part of it. Our job now is to get the UK to sign up or bugger off. Really?
I don't think I'll get it from the UK.
So, and specifically as far as Scotland is concerned, is to show that we are willing, we're ready, we're standing by, we want to do this, and we are not the nutters in the corner of a nuclear weapons armed state with a strange view. We are in tune with the mainstream, main world. We have the view of the world, and we are trying to explain that to these people that are bunkers at Westminster. What can I say? This was absolutely fabulous, and it was fabulous because it was awarded to a group. It was to a campaign, and it was recognition again that we're on the right track. We're doing the right thing here, and like I said earlier, we're all grains of sand. We are all able to be part of shifting the direction of that river. And here in Scotland, we can be as much part of that by working with our international colleagues. And just because the UK isn't paying attention to this, doesn't mean we can't work for the ban treaty and continue to work for the ban treaty. And so this was Setsuko's response to the ban treaty, and she talks about all the things that I've already said to you about being part of a team, about hearing the true story about these weapons, and She's just quite a marvellous person. So this is what we're going to do next year. This is really important. We've given ourselves a year so that we can organise a rally that will be the biggest rally that has happened for years. It's been a long time since we've done a big rally on nuclear disarmament. But I think this is absolutely core and fundamental to everything that we do for Scottish independence. Because if the abolition of nuclear weapons is in our gift, what a way to enter the world as an independent state. To be an independent state that disarms the first nuclear armed state, which we know that we can do. So we need to put nuclear disarmament absolutely at the heart of our independence campaigning. It's not just one thing, it's not just one tactic, it's not just talk about nuclear disarmament or talk about the economy, because everything else falls from that core value that we can have and do have and can share with the world, which is going back to that covenant statement about raising our eyes to the hills and putting peace and security at the heart of the kind of country that we want to have. We can be a country like Costa Rica. We don't need to be a country like the US of A. So it's really, really important that we achieve that message, and that as many people in the independence movement really understand this, because it's absolutely integral. So what we thought was that we would encourage, and I started talking about this at CND UK Council at the weekend, and there were some internationals there. And I was actually in New York when the Nobel Peace Prize news broke, and we were trying to arrange whether we could decide where we were going to have a rally, which is a bit difficult because it wasn't actually convenient to phone the rest of the CND executive. But anyway, we managed to get an agreement in principle that we would do something of the sort. And by the time I came back from New York, we have a commitment from American Ploughshares nuns to come to Scotland and do this with us. We had a commitment from disarmament campaigners in Israel. We think we've got it tough. What about campaigning for nuclear disarmament in Israel? They're going to come and help us to do this. There are people from France that are going to come and help us to do this. The Irish diplomats were absolutely delighted when I suggested to them that we would do this. And at the CND meeting in London, Joseph Gerson from the American Friends Service Committee was so excited about it and so positive about it. And Rainer Braun from Germany, from the International Peace Bureau and the No to NATO movement in Germany, so committed to coming. So we need to have every single little group in Scotland needs to be mobilising in their own community to bring people to Faslane. And it will probably be the 15th of September, but you'll get the news soon enough. We need to be making a big splash. We need to be making that place our own as it is, and not somewhere that the UK can store their wicked weapons. So Nicola came out with a good statement. Whether you're Green, Rise or whoever you are, it was still very good to hear that she is saying we will never accept a limit should be placed on the contribution that Scotland can make to peace. That, to me, whatever your politics are, is a hugely welcome statement. No ifs, no buts, no to weapons of mass destruction. And we can all work on the treaty, and it is work. And I brought these, this is not for giving out in the street. This is to help you get all the main arguments in comfortable language that you can become familiar with and utilise, and you can produce your own leaflets, you can take parts from this, or this is being produced for all the iCAN groups in the UK to use in whatever way they want. But as I say, it's not so much a document for giving out, it's a document for you to take home and read. You can get I meant to bring hard copies and we've run out of them, but we'll have more soon at the CND office, paper copies of the treaty itself, but you can get it on the website, so please do, because the treaty itself is full of the most wonderfully inspiring language. It's not a dry, dusty thing to read, it's really exciting, so make sure that you've got one of these. Now, the most immediate task, apart from starting to work on the rally next year, of course, is that we've got a big shortfall on a thing called the Parliamentarians' Pledge. One of the ways in which the international community is working together is to get parliamentarians to sign a pledge saying that they will collectively work to get governments to sign up to the Ban Treaty. Now, you would think that every Scottish parliamentarian would sign that with no problem. All they have to do, but they have to do it in this particular way. They have to send an email from their parliamentary email address to the iCAN International Group saying that they agree the wording of the pledge, which is basically that they're going to do that. Because it's not about, obviously, of course we want to be able to say 87% of Scottish elected representatives have signed the pledge, but what's really important is that that's part of an international movement of parliamentarians everywhere signing it. So you've got a constituency MSP, you've got 7 list MSPs. Get yourself familiar with this so that you can write yourself a script, send them an email, ask them to do it. They've all had a letter from me, they've all had a letter from Scottish CND, but they need a letter from you, and more particularly they need you to phone up and say, have you done it? And you can go onto the iCAN website and see whether they've done it. So you can say, I think you must have signed something else, which is quite likely. We need you to sign this. It's really important. So that's one of the things that we can do. And there's also a couple of working groups for the Ban Treaty. One that meets from time to time at the Scottish CND office, and there's a new one that's about to start meeting at UN House in Edinburgh. There's nothing to stop there being another one, but and there's also going to be a kind of round table of people that are working for iCAN across Scotland, which will probably take place around December, and we might make it a bit of a party because that's when iCAN gets going. So the other thing is just talking to people, and you know all this, you're radical independents, you know all this, but phone-ins. Don't let an opportunity go by. It's quite amazing. It's quite amazing how you can get any topic that Call K is on about and make it about nuclear weapons and phone up. So do it, writing to the papers, talking to people on the bus, all that stuff. So that's it. We pass around as well, please. I'm sure people have opinions or views or.
Are you taking questions from the internet?
Yeah, I've just going to say, I don't know if the kettle's warm enough, if anybody wants to see if they want the cold bin out. Well, there's plenty of cake. Thank you very much. I think we'll all agree that that was inspiring. Part of the aim of this meeting was that we hope to re-establish a CND presence in East Kilbride, separate from right we want to affiliate. George, when was the CND branch set up in East Kilbride?
When?
Tonight.
Ask the question again, will you?
But there was a CND branch in East Kilbride before, wasn't there? And it was faded away
Many years
ago. So we'd like to see that resurrected. So probably at our next RIC meeting, but we want it to spread outside RIC.
Yeah.
We want to get a strong CND presence back. So does anyone have any questions? You want to take some from the internet? If you got some?
Yeah, I've got a couple here. We've got Mary White. What does this ban mean for the Westminster decision to build yet more nuclear subs on the Clyde?
Well, it means they're crazy, because it means that they're doing the equivalent of buying a four-wheel drive car a week before they're going to be banned from the city centre in order to get to work. That's what it means. It's a really short-sighted, muddled, confused decision. It would certainly seem that the work for new weapons has already started. It's muddled, it's not clear. The timeline on their so-called gates for starting work all slipped, so it's behind schedule on some bits. They can't get safety clearance from the Americans on other bits. But they're still battering away at it in the same way as they're battering away at Brexit. It doesn't make sense, really.
But another one?
Yeah, when you go.
Okay, this is a comment and a question from Neil Willis. Just a comment there, are people having problems from tests on, still having problems from tests on Christmas Island? And he also says, why isn't USA, North Korea listening? They are the threat to peace.
The situation in North Korea is absolutely terrifying, and is an absolutely clear, to me, rationale for why the ban treaty is so necessary. There are still people suffering all over the world. And the suffering that goes on and the damage that's gone on and the lack of remediation for that damage creates and adds to the layers of conflict and resentment and pain and difficulty, and the only answer is to stop.
I've got one more question, is that okay? Because I know there might be people want to ask you questions. This is from Robin Leith Stewart. I know she's in the USA. I know that the majority of US citizens are appalled at the language coming out of the White House. Are there any substantial high-profile US dignitaries involved in this process?
There are some very fine US campaigners that are involved in disarmament activity, and I think our friend in the States should have a look at the iCAN website and see some of the organisations and the individuals that are involved. I mentioned Joseph Gerson from American Friends Service Committee. He's just one, but there are the Western States legal services against nuclear weapons. There's all sorts of very, very fine people, and then there are, of course, the Ploughshares Nuns and Brothers, and that are taking very brave direct action against the weapons in the States. I have huge time for the very, very brave and very positive and very uplifting action by US citizens as well who are involved in the peace movement. Yeah.
Right. Does anyone, Kirsten?
That was great, thank you very much. What influence can the ban treaty have on countries that haven't ratified it? Just can you explain a bit more about that? For example, the UK or the US?
Well, I think all of these things that the US suggested might come to pass are coming to pass now because of the treaty. It becomes very difficult The US has a frequent policy of neither confirm nor deny. Now, if they want to take a ship into or past or through the waters of a state that's signed up to the ban treaty, they can't get away with that anymore, or they won't be able to. If that is a state party to the treaty, and they cannot deny that they have nuclear weapons, they won't be able to root them in that particular way. There's a whole lot of stuff about military assistance between countries, which NATO is an obvious example of. And one of the ways in which the treaty has already had an impact is, I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but there is now, when the Netherlands diplomat said that they couldn't sign it because it would not be compatible with their NATO obligations, there was a very obvious answer, which is that NATO could change those obligations. I mean, it's not so long ago that most people thought that the nuclear first strike strategy was actually part of the North Atlantic Treaty. It's not. It's a policy, and it's a policy that could be changed. So, as I say, I'm not saying that's going to happen tomorrow, but people are talking about it. That already is a difference.
Mark?
I'm astounded at Australians. I mean, why are they so pro-nuclear weapons? Is it the old colonial spirit, or is it they feel threatened by China, for example?
I don't think they feel threatened by China. I mean, they have done some incredibly wicked things in terms of the deals that were cut with the UK to use huge tracts of their land to chuck plutonium around and explode it. And I hadn't realised until very recently how serious some of the impact of that testing was. The stuff that's lying about around Maralinga has a half-life of 24,000 years. Mm-hmm. You know, so if you've done things like that, there's a psychological need to say it must be justified. You know, but they're also under enormous pressure from the US, and in relation to the US dominance in the South Pacific. So that's really part of your answer. But I mean, it was very interesting. I went to the first committee this year as well, because we're trying to see whether we can move forward with trying to restart discussions around a nuclear weapons-free Middle East, and that was really the main reason that I was there. But it was quite amazing, the change in the discourse that was going on. There was a lot of talk about security assurances, which is something that isn't usually discussed there, whereby nuclear weapons states could be asked what they're actually going to do with their step-by-step. If they don't like the ban treaty, are they willing to make a negative security assurance that they will not use a nuclear weapon on a non-nuclear weapon state? Because the wording and the tone of the treaty make that a much more difficult thing to do. And there was even talk about whether or not there should be some efforts to curtail the existence of military bases outside of your own country. Why should you need military bases outside of your own country? Now, if that gains any kind of traction, that will make the whole situation around the South Pacific very different.
Kathy?
I'd like to know which country abstained on the treaty.
Singapore. And I think it was mostly because they couldn't, once the decision to have a vote only happened very late the night before, and all the diplomats have to check in with home base to do something that they've not been directed to do. And so, because that came as a very late, it was a late decision to hold the vote. They hadn't got clearance from
That's right.
their country to vote. So,
And I wanted to say, what do you think of the fact that they were saying that they've developed a new anti-missile missile to keep us safe in Scotland? And then they said they were actually going to move it to Japan next year, you know.
well, all of this stuff about missiles and defence and not being offensive, and it's all nonsense. All of these things are highly offensive, dangerous, catastrophically inhumane, indiscriminate weapons that will put all of us, the whole planet, at risk if there's any suggestion that they're going to be used in any way at all. So, I don't have expertise on missile defence. I mean, I was actually, there's some new work that's just been done on missile defence, and I didn't get to the workshop at CND, but I thought to myself, I know all I need to know about missile defence. It's not defence. It's just another aggressive attempt to gain dominance over countries that you've no business having dominance over. I'm actually going to ask David to speak a little bit about the work that Newquatch is doing on Unready Scotland and the convoys. But before I do that, I'll just say that the other point that you made about accidents and Luddites and so on, that one of the things that came out very, very clearly is that one of the greatest increases in the risk of accident is the fact that the new modernised systems are going to depend on computer protection, and there have been any number of incidents where the planet has nearly lost the plot and lost itself in the past, and they've all been prevented by human intervention. So I think that's a very, very dangerous move. And as far as cyber security is concerned, all that stuff about them throwing the signalling stuff into the drink to prevent the weapons from being visible, that technology is now outmoded, because the cyber technology means that you can't actually keep a nuclear submarine secret anymore. We've tried quite hard in a number of ways to deal with the convoy situation, and I'll let David tell you about the most recent effort.
Is there a copy of the...
I don't know if we wrote one. We didn't. I meant to write it in the case.
Actually, George has got a copy. Could I borrow your copy of Unready Scotland? Sure.
Which one are you looking for?
Unready Scotland. That's I'm like Janet Dang, part of Newquatch that tracks the convoys, so that people like Brian Quayle can stop them. Over here, is that better? And recently we published this report which is called Unready Scotland. And I was listening carefully to what George was saying about his motion. This ends up having a fairly modest request to the Scottish Government that they review the civil organisational response to the threat of the convoys. There's a petition on a Newquatch list which you can sign. I'd encourage you to sign it to say, please do that review. But this itself is I think, well worth reading from cover to cover. It's not very long. And it's pretty shattering what it says, not so much only about the convoys, but actually about how unprepared the Scottish civil authorities actually are to cope with any major incident. So,
and you can get it on the Newquatch website.
Yeah, and you can get a copy of this if you like as well.
Field track.
Thanks, George.
I think Debbie had.
Yeah, it was just to say I was horrified when Theresa May stood there and said she'd quite happily blow up half of Scotland and have an international effect on the rest of the world. And I'm so glad we've got the likes of yourself and David to counteract that.
All of us.
Scotland had the chance to get rid of nuclear weapons to start that, and I think that was a chance missed. I think it's embedded that maybe people don't think that it's just a given that nuclear weapons are there and there's nothing that can be done about it. But the works of yourself and all that kind of stuff shows that it's not.
It's
we can
not.
do, we can
It's
do
not.
so much
We
about
can
it.
change it. We can do this.
Yes, absolutely.
And Scotland is in a really unique position because we've got, I mean, everybody in this room I'm sure is well aware that we've got all the UK, I don't know whether everybody that's watching on live stream is aware that Scotland has all the UK's nuclear arsenal based here against the democratic wishes expressed through the ballot box of all its elected representatives. If we gain independence, there is a very short route to getting rid of Trident. But more importantly, Scotland doesn't just want to kick out Trident and put it in England. What we have the opportunity to do is to unite with the rest of the world, with the majority of world countries, with all of the peace-loving countries in the world, to create a world that doesn't even consider the use of nuclear weapons. We have the key to beginning to unlock not just the ban treaty and getting more signatures and getting the nuclear weapons on board, but the start of the elimination of nuclear weapons from the world. We can do this.
Randy, do you want to ask something there?
We were talking about the convoys and stuff like that. I sometimes see up on my Facebook, they're using trains going through to put their...
Not for weapons, for waste. But, I mean, the whole way in which nuclear weapons and nuclear waste are inextricably linked, and I'm very delighted to say, I haven't had a chance to look at it. She's going to send it to us and will hopefully come up and talk to us, and we might get some information at the Green Party conference. Caroline Lucas was at the CND conference, and they've been doing some research and using parliamentary questions to raise the issue of the funding for Hinkley Point and how closely related that is to the funding for nuclear weapons and the multinational companies that are developing them. The reason the UK government wants Hinkley Point is because it's a cheap way of building their next generation of nuclear weapons, and we don't want any part in either of it.
Right, we're almost running out of time, Roddy.
I was just going to say, this is probably actually more for your live stream audience. This is coming from East Kilbride, and it's only 32 miles, approximately 50 kilometres from this very room to the submarine base at Faslane. So for the folk who maybe further away from central Scotland, maybe don't appreciate how many folk, I think it's about almost 2 million people, live within 30 odd miles of these nuclear weapons, just up the road from here. That was an observation.
How crazy is that?
I would like to ask something actually. A lot of people don't realise what a massive nuclear arsenal Israel has. Now, if Israel were to get rid of its nuclear weapons, what sort of impact could that have in the Middle East situation, and in particular for Palestine?
Well, obviously it would be enormous, but in the Middle East, I think at the moment people are feeling that it's necessary to look at all weapons of mass destruction together and to try it and see whether it might be possible to get some negotiation on that. And the 2010 NPT review was supposed to look at that, and there was going to be a conference to explore it and bring different parties together, and that didn't happen. And it's another of the developments and the change in the discourse is that there is now the possibility of a behind closed doors informal get-together. There has already been a draft treaty that's been formulated to look at a Middle East without any weapons of mass destruction, and the hope that's created from the nuclear, the new treaty means that you might actually get some people beginning to have that conversation, and maybe by the time we get to 2020 and the next NPT review, we'll have a filling of the legal gap for Article 6 for nuclear weapons, and we'll have the beginning of a discourse around a nuclear weapons free Middle
I
East.
think we've got a question from online again.
Yeah, I've got multiple questions, but I'll only ask one because I know we're running out of time. Well, this one's from the admin of Yes Scotland's Future Facebook page, and that person asks, is it true that the UK Prime Minister couldn't launch a missile without permission and authorisation from the President of the United States?
That's quite a difficult question to answer. The missiles that the warheads are on are leased from the US. I think in real terms it's very unlikely that that would happen without some degree of cooperation. But do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I think it's politically very, very remote, but it's interesting that the late John Ainsley of Scottish CND was a bit of an expert on lots of the technical stuff, and he told us how that the guidance system for the UK's Trident system was developed in the States, and he thought it was inconceivable that that software would not have a US protective element in it, so that in fact they could actually influence at any point they wished. And John wasn't often making fantastical statements, so I thought, there's a lot of possibility.
Yeah.
I think politically and practically, it wouldn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
But you never know, you're somebody completely daft.
Yeah.
Kathy, did you have something?
It's just a point of technical information on that. If the UK actually did launch the missile, because the whole system is American based, the Americans could actually stop it. So it's not an independent missile anyway.
It's certainly not, and the missiles are leased from America, and it's certainly not. To describe it as an independent nuclear deterrent is nonsensical. It's not independent. It's the whole issue is profoundly confused, and the relationships are flawed, and the relationships are unimaginably subject to potential change in the current climate. It's a very, very unstable situation.
Well, I think that's 9:05, so I think that is just about us. I would like to say that Radical Independence East Kilbride are looking to affiliate to the Scottish CND as a group. We are also going to have a meeting on the 18th of November to set up and elect branch office bearers for an East Kilbride CND branch, and hopefully we'll get people from outside our own members. All the best people are Ricky Kay. I mean, listen, you're nobody if you're not a member of ours. And finally, Debbie has got something for you as a wee thank you. And please visit our stall. We've got campaign materials, gorgeous CND Christmas cards to buy.
Yes. Just to say on behalf of the KK, thank you for all the hard work yourselves and everybody else.